Right, welcome everyone to episode 7 of Sprint Lab or the Sprint Lab podcast, where today I'm going to be talking about how quickly Usain Bolt would have run if he didn't celebrate early in the 2008 Beijing Olympic final. So, the very famous race where at about 75 metres he starts celebrating, almost running sideways, slapping his chest. He ended up running 9.69, as you probably know, but obviously there's a lot of speculation as to how quick he could have gone if he didn't start celebrating that early and just ran through the line. So I'm gonna get into all of that. It is just me on this podcast. Me and Kieran were struggling to find a time recently that we could both hop on and record something. So apologies to everyone, first of all, for how late this is going to be out. Obviously, we normally try and upload every Friday. It's going to come out maybe Sunday or Monday, but hopefully going forward we'll be back on the Fridays. But also apologies if you guys are sick of my voice in any of these, because it's just going to be me going into this topic. But yeah, for those of you who are new, this will be also on YouTube as well as Spotify. Normally we just upload to Spotify, but since I'm going to be filming just me, and I've got obviously a YouTube channel, try and reach out to a bit of a bigger audience. So if you're seeing this on YouTube, make sure you go and check out the other podcast episodes on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you get your podcasts from. They're all available to download. I think we've been getting 100 downloads per episode recently, so pretty good engagement. Got a lot of people messaging me as well on Instagram and stuff saying they want to hear this and that. So I'll make sure to get those podcasts recorded for you when Kieran's back. But yeah, I'll just quickly introduce myself for those of you who are unaware. So my name is Alex, and sort of my background is in biomechanics and sports science. So I am currently working at the University of Lincoln as a sports science technician. My sort of background is all to do with biomechanics, sports science. It's currently what I do as a job. I teach first and second year biomechanics at university. My main role there is a sports science technician, so I dabble in all sort of domains of sports science, but biomechanics is like where my passion is. It's where I've done most of my research in the past. And obviously I'm a sprinter myself, so I sort of relate everything I do to sprinting as well and running. So obviously through my work and my job, as well as like my education, I've had a lot of opportunity to read biomechanics-based papers looking at kinetics and kinematics of sprinting and the key factors that influence running performance. And obviously I'm not saying I know everything, but I feel like I have a lot of knowledge to sort of shine a light onto this and go into this topic in quite some detail. So yeah, so that is a bit about me. This is a different sort of style topic to what we usually cover on Sprint Lab. Obviously we normally talk about, but hopefully it's just as interesting and insightful to you guys. I believe that you'll still find some useful things in this to relate to your own running. There are a lot of lessons, I guess, to learn in the breakdown of Usain Bolt's races. I also think the results might come as a surprise to some of you. So yeah, stick around to the end. Make sure you hear my verdict on how quickly Usain Bolt would have gone if he didn't celebrate. So I guess the easiest way I could sort of figure out how to talk about this with evidence is to use existing data that even at the IAAF published as official data for his 10 metre times for every 10 metre segment of the 3 fastest races of all time. And this comes from a paper that I read in the Journal of Kinetics, which is also available for free online, so go ahead and have a look at it yourself. It's a paper called A Kinematic Analysis of the 3 Best 100 metre performances Ever. Obviously the first thing to consider is the 3 best 100 metre performances ever were all by Usain Bolt, which is mental. So quickly, before we get into this Usain Bolt appreciation time, I think this guy is the greatest athlete of all time in any sport. I will argue with anyone about that. I know he didn't win as many gold medals at the Olympics as Michael Phelps or whatever. But I think if there was like a 50-meter race, he would win that. I think if there was a 150-meter race, he would win that. I know, like in swimming, you have different strokes and stuff. You have an opportunity to win more medals in swimming, is my argument. And I think the same in other sports. I think speed is one of the most athletic traits of anyone. I think it's the hardest thing to train if you don't have it. It is trainable, as we mentioned on the podcast, but I think if you have this natural ability and you have all this speed, I think everything else will come very easily to you compared to someone who doesn't have the speed, wants to get speed. But yeah, I mean, we're getting sidetracked. I think it's absolutely mental that the 3 fastest ever 100-meter times were all by Bolt, and the slowest of these 3 times is one where he stopped running at 75 meters to celebrate. Crazy. So obviously we're talking about his world record in 2009, which was 9.58 in Berlin. We are talking about the current Olympic record, 9.63, which he did at the London Olympics in the final, and of course the one in Beijing, 9.69, where he celebrated across the line in 2008. So this guy, like, only 3 people have ever run sub 9.7. Tyson Gane, Johan Blake, the other 2. But Usain Bolt's done it 3 times, and the slowest of the 3, he, slowed down, which is baffling. It's actually crazy. People, I don't think, appreciate how good he was, and he did all of this before super spikes really took off, before I mean, back then you had to run 3 races before the final. You had to do an additional like quarter-final round. So he was running like 4 rounds and doing this at championship events. I just think it's insane. And if you look at any of his races, you see how far ahead he finishes by the field. Just consider the last Olympics we just watched in 2024, how tight it was from first to last. If you watch any of Usain Bolt's races, you'll see him finish, and then there'll be like daylight and then a blanket finish between most of the other competitors. The exact same thing is happening now with the blanket finish. It's just Usain Bolt doesn't exist and he's not miles ahead, so it looks like everyone's level. The same was true if you took Usain Bolt out of the picture of most of his races, it would look just like a race today. I think that's really cool. But yeah, let's get into this, because like I briefly mentioned, the easiest way to break this down is to look at his 10-meter split times for every 10-meter segment of the 3 races and see, okay, in the last 30 meters, I think he started celebrating at 75, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt and say it was at 70 meters he started celebrating. So we're going to look at the last 3 10-meter sort of segments of these 3 races and see what he usually runs when he's running at these sort of speeds versus what he did run, and see how far off he was. But obviously that's a very simple way to look at this, so I'm also going to go into his running form as well and how that might have affected his performance. But I'm going to do so from a quantitative approach, so I'm going to try and keep my opinion out of this as much as I can. It would be very easy for me to sort of say, I think that because he rotated his body by this amount, he lost to this many seconds. I think that's a load of bullshit, for lack of a better term. Like, it's a load of nonsense. Anyone can say that, it's just an opinion. I think the easiest or the most effective way is actually measuring something. And so we'll go into that later on in the podcast. But yeah, for now, let's talk about his 10-meter segments. Okay, now it would be very easy for me to just talk you through his 10-meter times, his 20-meter time, 30-meter, 40, etc. for everything, for all 3 races we're comparing here. But like, that will get very boring and hard to follow. So I've sort of broken this down into a few different points that I think are the key differences between races. And I urge you guys to go and look at the paper yourself if you're more interested in the exact 10-meter splits, or just message me and I'll maybe make a post about it on YouTube or something. But in this, I think without me being there to sort of like walk you through it, it'll be quite hard to follow along. So yeah, we're going to sort of first of all talk about his time to 30 meters, because this is the only time that he's ahead of the current world record. So at 30 meter mark in 2009, so the current world record where he ended up running 9:58, he got to 30 meters in 3.80 seconds. Okay, and in 2008 he got to 30 meters in 3.78 seconds. Okay, so he started his first 30 meters in 2008 better than he did in 2009. This time includes his reaction time, which was a lot better in 2008, which is crazy to think he ended up running a world record that still stands today with a pretty crap reaction time. But yeah, he was only slightly ahead in 2008 at 30 meters than he was in 2009. Interestingly, the reason I picked out 30 meters is just because that is the last time in 2008 that he's ahead of the world record. So at 40, 50, 60, all of these times later on, he's behind the world record. So my point is, yes, he slowed down in the last 30 meters, which we're going to get onto, but even if he didn't slow down, he would have had to have sped up to catch up to the world record, if that makes sense. Either sped up or decelerated a lot slower than he did in 2009. So that's the first thing I'd say is, yes, he celebrated early and did slow down, which we're going to get onto, but he wasn't necessarily ahead of the 2009 world record. In fact, at 70 meters, he ran 7.14 seconds in 2008. In 2009, he ran 7.11. So he was already ahead in Berlin, slightly, albeit slightly ahead. And in 2009, as we're going to see, he maintained some crazy top-end speed, which he also does in London 2012. Don't want to forget that race, because that is the current 2012 is the current Olympic record. So that is the first sort of thing I wanted to touch on, is that by 30 meters he was only slightly ahead, and that was the last time he was ahead in 2008. So I've touched on this, but the last 30 meters is obviously also very important here to consider. So his last 30 meters in Beijing was only 0.07 seconds slower than Berlin. So for all that celebrating he did, he only lost 7/100ths of a second than the time he posted in the last 30 meters in Berlin. Interestingly, and I think this is interesting because this gives us a couple avenues to go down, in London he ran 0.1 seconds quicker than he did in the last 30 meters of Beijing. So his best last 30 meters was posted in London 2012, which obviously gives us two things to consider. I really hope you guys are following along here, because obviously with you just listening, I can't tell what you're following and not. But if you consider the fastest ever race he ran was 2009, he ran the last 30 meters 0.0 seconds faster than in 2008. Like, that's one consideration you could have. However, you could also say, but the fastest he's ever run for the last 30 meters was in 2012, where he was 0.1 or 1/10 faster than in 2008. So maybe you're in the camp of, if he was running that quickly up to 70 meters, he wouldn't have been able to run as fast as he did in London in 2012. Or maybe you're in the camp of, you got to give him the benefit of the doubt and say, back in Beijing 2008, he was at a higher peak and could have maintained a much higher max velocity for longer. I'm happy to go with either or option, but I think you can tell that even if he'd run 1/10 of a second quicker, like he did at his best ever last 30 metres in a 100-metre race, he would still only have run, I say still only have run, he would have run 9.59 in Beijing. Now, that is obviously mental. Obviously, he's the only person to have ever run sub 9.6, and this would sort of suggest he would have done it twice. The Olympic record would obviously be way quicker than it is. Well, way quicker. Would have been quicker than it is. And I guess it would have been the first and only race to have broken at the time 9.6. The crazy thing would have been that this is crazy. So the previous world record before he ran 9.69 at Beijing, the previous world record was 9.71, 9.72. So it would have been absolutely bonkers if he'd run a 9.59 when no one else in the world ever had even gone under 9.7. Like, imagine that. No one's ever gone sub 9.7. And obviously leading up to Usain Bolt, you had people chipping away at breaking world records all the way from the first man, Jim Hines, to go sub 10 to Carl Lewis going like 9.8, and then Donovan Bailey coming along, breaking world records, Asafa Powell coming along, breaking world records, and then all of a sudden this guy Usain Bolt comes along. He's only like 21, 22 at the time, and imagine he ran 9.59. No one's even touched 9.6, and he goes, nah, skip 9.6, let me go to 9.5. That would have been bonkers. And yeah, that would have been absolutely mental. However, I think what he did makes the race just as, or if not more memorable than if he had just run 9.59. Obviously, in hindsight, because obviously the year later he goes 9.58, you can sort of say, okay, 9.59 wouldn't have been that good. Now, I don't know how you want to look at this, whether you want to say if he'd run 9.59 before anyone else had ever run, including himself, had ever run sub 9.7, that could have been it. That could have been the best thing. That could have been the most memorable thing in sport, or the sport of athletics. It would have been insane. And the sort of percentage of improvement would have been so big. You know, skipping 9.69, like 9.69 to 9.58 is crazy. That's what he did between 2008 and 2009. But imagine skipping from 9.71 or 9.72, I can't remember which one he done, to 9.59. That would have also been insane. He's skipping out all of the 9.6s, which is just extraordinary that he could have done that. But what he did do was celebrate at 70 metres, beating his chest while running, and it's one of the most iconic poses in sport, in Olympic history. Like, that image of him celebrating so far ahead of everyone, still breaking a world record, still being the first person, and still one of only 3 people to have gone sub 9.7, to touch 9.6. It's either way, you're going to remember him as one of the best ever. And I think that's what's so good about Bolt. Despite the fact he celebrated and ran it well, you're gonna remember that race. And yes, maybe more people would remember it if he'd run a 9.5 before anyone had run 9.6. But I don't know. It's hard to say. And honestly, it doesn't actually matter. History's written now, and I don't think anyone can actually argue that he's not the greatest sprinter of all time. It is what it is. Just a quick mention as well on 2008, 9 and 12. In 2008, I think the official wind reading was 0 metres per second. So he had no headwind, no tailwind, which I never really know how much you can, fully trust wind readings, because I've been in races where I felt like there's been massive headwind. You look at the wind reading, it says 0. Or there's a tailwind, and you look at the wind reading, it says 0, and you're like, that's a bit sus. Obviously, at the highest level, you'd assume the officials get it right, and they don't forget to make a reading or whatever, but I'd never know how to trust it. When something says 0, I get a bit suspicious, like surely there's a bit of wind swirling around that stadium. So for them to say it was 0 meters per second, I think is odd, but it could have been true. And considering he ran that quickly in 0 meters per second, I mean, what are we saying? Maybe he ran 9.59 with no wind. Bonkers. Especially when you consider his 2009 world record was with a plus 0.9 meter tailwind, so pushing him along a bit. And then 2012, the Olympic record that still stands, he ran with a plus 1.5 meter per second tailwind. So his other two, the other two races which he ended up ultimately in the history books, it says was a quicker time, were with stronger winds. So then that adds the question as to, okay, what if he had the same amount of wind pushing him along when he ran 9.69? Would he then have run a quicker time? And the answer is probably yeah. Like if he'd run under the exact same conditions but run through the line, he probably would have run a time quicker than 9.58. And that is just the way it goes sometimes. I mean, he ended up running, I'm pretty sure he ran the 200 meter world record in Berlin into a headwind, which is, it's messed up how quickly the guy was. I'm so lucky I got to watch Usain Bolt growing up. I was like just about old enough to remember it quite well. And then I was in the stadium actually when he pulled his hamstring in his last ever race in London 2017. Yeah, he got actually like it was weird. It was mixed emotions because I was really looking forward to seeing Usain Bolt run, but also seeing him like pull up halfway down the straight was tough. But also Britain won the relay by like 1,000th of a second or something over Team USA in that 4x1. I remember Mitchell Blake against Christian Coleman on the last leg, and I remember like me and my brother were sat next to each other going mad, like that's crazy. But then you see Usain Bolt like crying on the track and you thought that's crazy. But yeah, I got to watch Usain Bolt in person. I'll never forget it. He did like his little, not stride out, but you know when they set up they set up where they're putting the tape to go for the relay. He obviously did his little run out with that, his practice run out on the track. Ran about 40 metres. Me and my brother looked at each other, I'll never forget, and we were like, what the hell have we just witnessed? It was so quick. Seeing him in person, like all of them sprinters, if you get a chance to go and watch them in person, just do it, because it doesn't do it justice how quickly they're moving on TV. When you see them in person, running that quickly, covering that ground that quick, it's mental. You know, this paper's really good because it tells you the velocity they're running at. So actually, for about 40 or 50 metres in the race, Usain Bolt is running over 12 metres per second. If you were to, and this is funny because the last lecture I was in teaching, we got a tape measure out and we moved it 12.5 metres across the room, which is Usain Bolt's average velocity for a certain 10 metre segment of a race. And when I say average, that means somewhere within that 10 metre segment that's the average for, he ran even quicker than 12.5 metres per second. But if you measured out 12.5 metres per second in a room, bearing in mind this is a big lecture theatre, and it's almost from one end of the hall all the way to the top, and he's covering that every second. It's a massive distance, and it just baffles me how quickly this guy could move. It's one of the things, you gotta watch these elite sprinters running in person. It's actually bonkers. But yeah, he was running 12.5 metres per second. That is like 27, 28 miles per hour. Words don't do it justice, honestly. I don't, obviously I can speak about this as much as I want, but I just thought it's crazy. You want to know how quickly he was moving for each 10 metre velocity segment, for each 10 metre segment? So in 2009 he had 1, 2, 3, 4. What? In 2009 he had 6 10 metre segments above 12 metres per second. That's it's just insane. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In 2012 he had 5 above 12 meters per second, and in 2008 he had 4 above 12 meters per second. His last 10-meter segment in 2008 was, I say only, but it was only 11.11 meters per second, which is a massive drop off for someone of his ability, who's maintaining in excess of 12 meters per second for so long, to be almost a whole meter per second down. That's obviously going to contribute to his slower last 10-meter time, which, like, 12 meters per second equates to somewhere between 0.8 and 0.85 10 meters fly time. Yeah, which, if you've ever tried to do a 10-meter fly, you'll know it's exponentially harder to get a little bit quicker. That's just laws of physics. The quicker you get, the harder it is to get even quicker. It's the same as running a 10-second flat 100. Not that I've ever done it, but I can imagine running at 10.1. You feel so close to the 9-second barrier, but for every time you race, you just struggle because it's so much harder when you're that good to break a tiny bit off. And then there's this guy who's rocking up and doing 9.5. It's stupid. It's stupid, isn't it? I drifted away, I guess, from the analysis there a little bit. But I think the main thing I want to conclude with that, looking at just 10-meter split times, is, in my opinion, based on all of that knowledge, I think the world record would still be 9.58. If the question is if he didn't celebrate, everything else stays the same, he just didn't celebrate, I think the quickest he could have run is 9.59. And I think more accurately, the quickest he would have run, in my opinion, was maybe 9.63. I mentioned earlier that, and obviously your guys are probably thinking that just looking at 10-meter times and average 10-meter split times of other races isn't the best indicator as to how quick he would have gone. And you want to hear from qualified sports scientists to actually talk about a technique and how much their technique is affecting their motion. And so that is what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and talk about not only what we do know and we could measure in terms of times, but also he's literally rotated side on, running and celebrating. Surely that has to influence how quickly he ran. And so from a sports science perspective, I want to just try and explain to you and break this down and explain why that's not necessarily the case. Much to some of your disappointment, it doesn't necessarily mean he's going to slow down a lot. And so, as a biomechanist, people will come up to me and say, please, can you improve my performance? I do this sport. Let's say it's sprinting. I'm a sprinter and I want to improve my sprinting performance. The first thing any biomechanist will do is create what we call a deterministic model for that sport, whether that be for a high jump, for a javelin throw, for a basketball performer, a rower, or a sprinter. Deterministic model is the first thing we do. So a deterministic model, essentially, the first thing you need to do with this is determine what is the key performance outcome for that, for the sport, for the activity being performed. And in running, that is the time. Yeah, that is ultimately in a sprint. All you want to improve ultimately is your running time, and that is your main goal. From that, you then split this little branch down into little sub-factors of influencing running time. So your primary factors might be something like the race distance is obviously going to impact what time you can run. You might also have your average running velocity. Okay, so these are two things that you split time into that you can look at. Now, you can't really do much with the running distance that is set in stone, but you can do something with average velocity. Okay, so you have your average running velocity, which could split into your stride length and your stride frequency, for example. These are two things which make up your average running velocity. Now, let's say you wanted to split up stride frequency. You could split that into your ground contact times and your flight times, yeah? And as you can see, you're breaking down bits further and further into little subcategories. And the reason we do this is because when we're programming something to improve a sprinter's ability or an athlete's ability, you have to break down the components so that you're focused on one component at a time. It's too hard. There are too many components influencing a sprinter's performance. You need to prioritize what are the strengths and what are the weaknesses, and you need to do an in-depth analysis, way more detailed than I've just gone into here. Like, you need to be considering things like your takeoff distance, your flight distance, the different joint angles, your projection height, your projection angle. All these things make up a sprinter's ability to improve their stride length or improve their stride frequency, which in turn improves their average velocity, which in turn improves their overall time. So you can see that you have this model of different factors, and at the very bottom of the model are the factors that you can directly train in a program. So let's, for argument's sake, say a bottom factor is your ground contact time. That's what we want to improve. Your ground contact time is going to directly influence your stride frequency, which is going to influence your average velocity, which is going to influence your running time. So the point is, linking this back to Usain Bolt and what he did, these tiny little things at the bottom of these branches are going to have an influence on the things higher up on the branch. For example, stride frequency and stride length. And if these things had a major impact on his running time, then you would see it in the stride length and stride frequency, which are a little bit lower down. What this analysis was able to do was able to look at his stride length and his stride frequency in all of these races, because we can quite simply measure those just by using certain models and analysis software. You can quite simply measure these things with pretty good accuracy. Obviously not gold standard technology in a lab, but with what you have access to, it's possible. And what you would see is, if these things were majorly influenced by his funny running form at the end from celebrating, these things would be majorly flagged. And what we actually see when measuring these is only really his stride frequency goes down of his race in Beijing. So if you want the actual stats, his stride frequency goes from about 4.5, 4.6 to 4.2, and then eventually 4.0 in the last 10 metre segment. Which, look, okay, fair enough, that is quite significant drop off from 4.6. But yeah, his stride length is his stride length is actually just as long, if not longer, in the last 30 metres of the Beijing race than it was the rest of the race. So really, his turnover speed has gone down. He's still putting in enough force to move or to travel as far with each step, but he's just not doing as many steps. But look, ultimately that all stems down to his average time, which for each 10 metre segment was still 0.82, 0.83 seconds until the last 10 metres, which was 0.9. Imagine saying 0.90 seconds is slow for a 10 metre segment. Relatively, it's slow for his other races, which were all 0.83, 0.82. Yeah, but I guess what I'm trying to say is, even if you were to measure these different levels of the deterministic model, he's not that affected by the breakdown in form. And yes, you wouldn't coach someone to run like that. Let's put it that way. You wouldn't say, do what Usain Bolt did and celebrate running side on. But at the same time, when you actually break it down and measure the important things impacting running time, it doesn't have much effect on the ground contact times and flight times, because his stride frequency was still pretty similar, or his stride length was still pretty similar. His stride frequency did decelerate, did go down, but in my opinion not enough to influence what we already know happened with his 10 metre segment times. I hope I've done an okay job explaining that. It's quite hard to sort of explain it when I'm just talking to myself on a computer screen, because obviously in my head it all makes sense, but trying to describe it to a computer screen and without Kieran being there to sort of ask questions and intervene is quite difficult. So let me know if we should redo this episode later on at some point, or if there's any questions you have, or want me to do another video with, like, I don't know, graphics and stuff on YouTube that might make it easier to follow along. Let me know. But ultimately, I think Usain Bolt would not have run a quicker world record than 9.58 had he not celebrated. So I basically want to shut down all the rumours of people saying Usain Bolt would have run 9.4 if he'd not celebrated, etc. So I don't think, unfortunately, he would have run quicker than 9.58. I don't think he would have run quicker than 9.63, to be honest. But yeah, you guys can argue it. I'm pretty convinced, based on the data I've seen and the analysis sort of you can do, that he wouldn't have run quicker than 9.63. But like, I could be swayed with more evidence or with more people arguing. And obviously there's no way of actually knowing, because you can't go back in time and watch it and tell him, just run through the line, mate. You can't do that. There's not going to be a true, definite answer, is the point I'm making. I think, as well, by him celebrating the way he did and running still the first ever sub 9.7, ultimately is an achievement remembered more than the current Olympic record. You know, people think of Usain Bolt and they'll talk about him celebrating early and still running a world record and stuff. They all do that a lot more readily than they will talk about the current Olympic record, where he just ran through the line. And up until, I think it was up until the 2024 Olympic final, that was considered the fastest ever 100 metre final in the Olympics, because all but Asafa Powell, who pulled up, ran sub 10. So like, that has every right to be remembered as one of the fastest ever 100 metres. But no one remembers it. Well, not as many people remember the London Olympics as much as they do the Beijing, because of the manner he won it in, celebrating across the line, being so far clear. But who knows? I'd be really interested to see what you guys think of it, though. Tell me your opinions either in the comments below, message me, ask me to do another episode on this if that needs to be more clear, because I appreciate you might have found that struggle to follow along, especially because I can see the times on the screen and you obviously can't. And yeah, you can't obviously ask me questions halfway through. But I hope that's kind of informative for you guys to listen along. I'm really sorry Kieran wasn't here today, but yeah, he'll be back in future episodes. Yeah, thanks for listening. Really appreciate everyone's support so far. I think getting up to like 100 downloads per episode is really like motivates us to keep going and keep producing more for you. Really sorry this is going to be out late again, but chat to you as soon as we can in the next one. So peace out, guys. Thanks.